The story began on a cold December evening, with the wind howling through the cracks of old windows and shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Sarah, a second-year college student, was alone in her parents' large old house for the weekend. Her parents were visiting her grandmother and she had volunteered to stay behind, claiming she needed peace and quiet to finish her assignments. The house was an old Victorian-style home, full of character but riddled with strange noises, creaking pipes, occasional thuds from the attic. Sarah had grown up with these sounds and had long since learned to ignore them. But that night, something felt different. She had just settled in the living room with her laptop and a hot cup of tea when she heard it for the first time. Faint, rhythmic knocking. It wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. She froze, holding her breath, listening carefully. The sound stopped. Just the house settling, she told herself, shaking her head. But the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, as she was finishing up an essay, the knocking returned. This time it was louder and more urgent, as if someone was knocking in a hurry. Sarah froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound moved, traveling from one side of the room to the other, as if something, or someone, was crawling inside the walls. "Maybe it's a raccoon or a squirrel," she muttered, trying to calm her racing heart. She stood up and cautiously walked around the room, pressing her ear to the walls. The knocking stopped again. For a moment, all she could hear was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the wind rattling the window panes. Deciding to ignore it, she returned to her laptop. By midnight, Sarah was feeling sleepy. She turned off the lights in the living room and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. As she passed the hallway mirror, she thought she saw something move in her peripheral vision. She turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. "Get a grip, Sarah," she whispered, hurrying to her room. She closed the door behind her, a habit she'd picked up after years of watching too many true crime documentaries. Crawling under the covers, she held her phone in her hand, scrolling through social media to distract herself. But just as she began to relax, she heard it again, the knocking. This time, it was coming from directly behind the headboard of her bed. She held her breath. Slowly, she sat up, clutching her phone like a weapon. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped, replaced by a low scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. Thoughts raced through Sarah's mind. Could it really be an animal? But how could something move so deliberately, following her from one room to another? She stared at the wall, her heart pounding. Then, to her horror, she heard a voice. "Let me out." The words were barely a whisper, but they were clear enough to send a shiver down her spine. She jumped out of bed, backing away from the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor. "Who's there?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Silence. Then the knocking returned, more violent than before. The walls seemed to shake with the force. Grabbing her phone, Sarah bolted out of the room, her bare feet pounding on the wooden floor. She ran downstairs to the kitchen, fumbling to turn on the lights with shaky hands. But before she could catch her breath, the pantry door slowly creaked open, its hinges groaning loudly. There was no one there, just darkness. She approached cautiously, clutching a heavy cast-iron skillet she found on the counter. Cold sweat dripped down her forehead. "If someone's there, come out now," she shouted, her voice breaking. Suddenly, a pale, slender hand emerged from the darkness. Its fingers were unnaturally long, with cracked nails. Then a face appeared. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a twisted, eerie grin. Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs and swung the skillet with all her strength. The figure stumbled back, letting out an inhuman shriek. Sarah fled the house, her legs barely carrying her. She ran through the dark yard until she reached her neighbor's home, Mr. Jenkins, a retired police officer. She banged on the door frantically until he opened it, startled by her panicked state. "There's something in the house," she cried, trembling. Mr. Jenkins grabbed a flashlight and a baton and went to check the house. He returned 20 minutes later, shaking his head. "There's no one there, Sarah," The doors are locked and the house is empty. Are you sure you didn't imagine it? Sarah knew what she had seen, but she couldn't argue. She stayed at Jenkins's house that night, unable to return. The next morning, when her parents returned, she told them everything. They were skeptical, but agreed to call a professional to inspect the house. What they discovered was horrifying. Behind the walls, in a small crawl space, they found a makeshift bed, empty food wrappers, and notebooks filled with incomprehensible scribbles. It seemed someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months. But the most chilling discovery was a single phrase, written over and over on the walls of the crawl space. "Let me out."